Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Angela Bowl. I'm the CEO of the Independent Book Publishers Association, and it's my great pleasure to open our virtual Publishing University Conference, officially open it, with our opening keynote address. We're here with Brooke Warner from She Writes Press. She's going to be speaking on disrupting the publishing industry. It's a bright and early 8 a.m. here on the West Coast, a little bit later as you get over to New York City, but we're really glad that you're here. Hope you have your coffee, and we're excited to talk to Brooke. I'm going to walk through some housekeeping items here at the top. We've encouraged all the attendees here to be chatting away, and we're going to be saving that chat for folks that are going to watch this later. And we're going to have a robust question and answer session with Brooke here coming up at the end as well. But first, let's look at a couple housekeeping items. Our antitrust guidelines at IBPA are important, and you'll hear them over and over. I've joked that we need to make a song out of these guidelines so that they become a little bit more palatable to everybody. But just to vocalize them, we're at conference to explore avenues of mutual interest and cooperation. It's important to recognize that these activities are subject to certain legal limits imposed by state and federal antitrust laws. During the conference, discussions among members that could be interpreted as collusion on pricing, sales terms, territories, production, or other aspects of competition must be avoided. So if you think you're headed in such an area, please raise the issue with an IBPA staff member as soon as possible. So the main question I usually get on an association's antitrust guidelines is, does that mean I cannot talk about prices at all? And the answer is no, it's not a zero tolerance policy. This you can tell people what you charge for your children's picture book, for example. You just can't then ask everybody to charge the same thing so you can put those other people out of business. If it starts to feel a little nefarious in terms of what you're trying to do, that's collusion, and that's what we can't do. But you can talk about what are acceptable price ranges, what are kind of acceptable royalty rates. Those kinds of things are totally fine. So don't be too scared of this legal language. Just don't, use it well. And don't try to put other people out of business, and you'll be fine. I'm very excited about the virtual part of conference. We have been on a journey, as everybody has, and trying to figure out what is the sweet spot for conference. As you know, our 2020 conference was canceled just 1 month before it went forward. It was supposed to go forward. We had nothing that year. In 2021, we did a fully virtual conference on this exact platform. And here this year, we're doing virtual this week and in person next week. I'm not sure if the staff will allow us to continue that pace, but I'm hopeful because I think this is really wonderful to have the opportunity to meet you guys virtually and then come together next week in Orlando, Florida. We have built a virtual world. If you haven't seen Christopher Locke's session from yesterday, where he walked through this platform and showed you all the bells and whistles and how to get the best experience, I recommend heading over to that schedule tab right here and going to yesterday, and you can watch that session in real time right now. I think it would behoove you because this is it. It's going to go fast, and before you know it, this week will be over and we'll be done with all of the live virtual parts of Publishing University. So I'm excited about the virtual world. I hope you will engage with it as much as possible. And though the world was virtual, the swag was real. If you are a virtual only attendee, I hope you got your swag box from the sponsors. Amazing amount of goodies came in the swag box. We had to set a deadline for ordering one. So we emailed that many, many times to everyone who registered on time. I hope you got it. It was an amazing feat to put all of that gear together and ship it out to you guys, but we're very, very happy to do so. And if you are a all access ticket holder, you're going to get all of this beautiful, wonderful stuff when you see us in Orlando, Florida, coming up soon. So in person, people will get your swag on site, and virtual, hopefully you're writing in that Jostens notebook as we speak. All the swag is compliments of your exhibitors listed here. You have the opportunity to meet with all of these companies during Publishing University, both virtually and in person. So I hope you do take advantage of that while you're here. They are very interested in chatting with you, even if you're not sure exactly what you might be able to do with a particular company. You can still jump on a call with them and talk to them about their services and get to know them a little better. That's always a good education. Today we have virtual exhibitor hour, just a completely blank time in the schedule 1 hour where all of our exhibitors will be over on their exhibitor page, and you can just hop into one-on-one meetings with them. Hopefully, we've sent out enough materials that these meetups or meet nows, I think they're called, are clear to you and familiar to you, and you know how those work. If not, you could take a second to watch the video that Christopher Locke did on the Attendify platform, which is mentioned. It's over on the schedule tab. But this is a great opportunity during a particular hour in each day, today and tomorrow, where you know the exhibitors will be available to you and you can set one-on-one meetings. There's lots of interesting conversations, I think, that you can have if you take advantage of this time period during the session. And you could also do our treasure hunt, which you'll find in the Attendify platform, with game cards that are due before 2 p.m. Pacific tomorrow. If you do the treasure hunt, I think the most interesting part are the prizes. So we'll select a couple winners of the treasure hunt, and you will get a free pass to the Publishing University Conference next year, which in person will be in San Diego, California. And you'll also get 750 IBPA dollars, if you will, to spend on any marketing program, to spend on renewing your membership, to spend on anything you want in the system if you are able to win the treasure hunt. And also it's kind of fun. Terry Nathan in the IBPA office put the treasure hunt together, and I thought some of the questions were funny. So if you share my sense of humor at all, you will also think some of the questions are funny, and hopefully it'll be fun as well as educational experience, and you could win amazing prizes. I think we do have some people here at conference who won treasure hunt last year. So if you are, wave to folks in chat and let them know it's real. You can win. You too can be a winner. All right, these people, these are your IBPA staff members, and it's a small but extremely mighty crew. So I'm going to say in every session that I'm in, I'm going to pull up this picture, and I'm going to just say, please thank these people. They've been working so hard for all the days of every year, but particularly getting this conference ready. And the fact that I doubled up on them and said, we're not just going to do one conference, we're going to do two, and we're going to put them back to back. And every single person here said, okay, that sounds exactly right. Sounds exactly what the members need. So they've been working very hard. I want to thank Ilse, Terry, Christopher, Adeline, and Lee for being here. You'll see them all through the conference. You'll see them in the virtual help desk. Couldn't have a better group of folks here to assist in this program and to help build it as well. So thank you to the staff. I really appreciate it. And I know our members do too. Questions? No, we're not done. I realized when I pulled this up, it looks like we're done. That's the keynote. Thank you for coming. No, this is just to say, I'm about to introduce Brooke Warner, your keynote for today. I talked to Brooke about how she would prefer to take questions, and she wants to take a lot of questions. We've kind of split this into a little bit 50-50. So she's going to provide her keynote. You should send your questions in the Q&A as she goes along, just to kind of have them place held. And we should all be uploading those questions too, because after her keynote, we're just going to be opening to a Q&A. So if you were, again, in the annual meeting yesterday, you'll understand this a little bit, because we did it in the annual meeting as well. We had the presentations, and then we all came up and we had a conversation. So think about the questions you'd like to ask Brooke as we go along. I will facilitate that Q&A when her keynote is done. And hopefully we'll have a really robust conversation. It's always wonderful to be here live so that we can do that together, and it's not the opportunity to ask exactly what you want to know. So that's what that means. Not that we're done. We're not done yet. More to do. For example, got to introduce you to Brooke Warner, here to talk about disrupting the publishing industry. So technically, Brooke is the publisher of She Writes Press and SparkPress, and she's president of Warner Coaching, Inc. She's written many books, which I think is always a good sign when a publisher is also an author. They understand both sides of the equation. She's written nonfiction books for the most part. Not Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, which we do sell in the IBPA bookstore, What's Your Book, and 3 books on memoir. She really is the memoir queen, if any of you are in the memoir space. She's a TEDx speaker. She's a podcaster. And I first met Brooke, I think probably 8, maybe 10 years ago, when she joined the IBPA Board of Directors. And I pretty much knew right away that we were going to be friends and that she was going to be a helpful colleague in the publishing industry. She doesn't suffer fools gladly. And from my perspective, that's a compliment. I also feel the same, but she approaches everyone with respect and generousness of spirit, which is a wonderful combination, I think, to find in a person. She's truly helpful with no ulterior motive. And it's lovely to be around her. So for 6 years, Brooke served as a member of the IBPA Board of Directors. The first 4 years, she was an at-large member, and the second 2 years, she was the chair of the Board of Directors. During this time, she launched the IBPA Advocacy Committee, which is great. I think she was the very first chair of this committee. And she helped develop IBPA's industry standards checklist for a professionally published book, as well as our hybrid publisher criteria, two really important documents that work to help level the professional playing field for independent publishers. I think, in fact, a lot of people will say Brooke coined the term hybrid to describe a particular kind of partnership publishing. So she might, I think, I haven't heard her keynote yet, but I think she might talk a little bit about that too, and what it was like to be a disruptor in that space when people were very confused about what partnership publishing could look like. So in the same year she took over as chair of the IBPA board, Brooke launched a podcast that I love. And if you know me, you know I listen to a lot of podcasts and I love to recommend them. Hers is called Write Minded, WRITE. And she does this with her co-host, Grant Faulkner, who's the executive director of NaNoWriMo. Very curious if any of you have done NaNoWriMo. I think the month for that is November. So it's over, but it's coming back up. That's how the years work. Months just come one right after the other. So the podcast with Grant, I can't remember monthly, weekly, but it's great. It's short, it's sweet, but there's surprising guests that pop up, and it's very inspiring. So I recommend if you have a minute after this or during this to go ahead and subscribe to Write Minded. About 6 months ago, I was reading Publishers Weekly, as we do, and I came across Brooke's byline. She writes for Publishers Weekly. She has a regular column over there. And the byline of this article was what it would take to disrupt the publishing industry, which I thought was such a very Brooke title, such a very Brooke thing to think about. And here I read, Brooke wrote, if we are to truly disrupt the publishing industry, it is the system itself that we need to overhaul. And I also read that she wrote, a real disruption of the industry would involve accountability because we are wasteful beyond belief. And I thought that is very interesting and very truthful. Feels like we're hitting the nail on the head. And we're also being honest about things in our industry that we don't talk about very much. So I wanted to know more. And I asked her to keynote IBPA Publishing University 2022. And just the spoiler alert is she said yes, and she's here. So if Brooke wants to come up on the screen, I'd like to introduce you formally, officially. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Hello, we can see you. Nice
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I know we kind of pushed it off of this disruption article that you did for Publishers Weekly. There's a lot of things you can talk about. I'm very excited to hear.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, I'm excited as well. And are we getting going right out the gate, or?
We're going to go right out of the gate. So the questions that folks have, go ahead and keep them coming. Sometimes my brain I forget what I was thinking of. So any question that comes to you as Brooke is speaking, push it in the Q&A right away. We can upvote those questions as she goes along, but we're going to jump right into it, and then we'll have some fodder to talk about. We'll come back for a more formal kind of Q&A with the audience when you're done.
Excellent. I look forward to that very much. And I will just jump off from what Angela was just saying about when she approached me on this topic. I actually, as Angela said, I've been called a disruptor myself. So I've been following this. What does disruption really mean? And then I started to see all the ways in which the media in particular likes to call people disruptors. And I thought to myself, like, what does it really even mean to be a disruptor? I think it's sort of a catchphrase. And I realized I was a bit irritated by the way that the media was talking about disruptors, things that are not necessarily new. You know, it really became this kind of buzzword. And I looked into it a little bit more to see that, of course, being a disruptor is really about making change. It's being a change maker in a given industry. And so that article that I wrote, as often is the case, came out of a bit of frustration or irritation on my part. And I think that's where we find our passion sometimes. I know for myself, I'm often motivated to make change in this industry out of frustration and sometimes anger. And certainly early on in my She Writes Press days, I was fueled by a lot of anger and frustration. I mean, some of you who know me know that well, because it's a fight. You know, you're always out there kind of having to prove yourself. Maybe you yourself feel like a bit of an underdog, or that certain aspects of the industry don't take you seriously. And I think that that's actually a good thing. You know, it makes us work harder. It makes us down in the trenches. And importantly, it helped me to find my community. And so I want to start there to say, you know, who are we, the members and publishers of IBPA? We're traditional publishers, we're hybrid publishers, we are author publishers. And then there are many of you here who are part of the ecosystem, right? You're vendors, you're connected in different ways to the community. You might be freelancers, you might be authors who've published with sometimes a traditional publisher or a hybrid publisher. And what I love about IBPA, and why I felt immediately at home here when I first met Angela, as she said, all those years ago, and then later when I joined the board, is because I love that IBPA is inclusive. You know, and the reason that it's inclusive is because there's a real motivation here to educate so that everybody is doing the absolute best job that they can with the books that they're creating. And then also, I think there's a real desire here, as I know is true for me, to level the playing field, right? So that we don't have all of these false measures that exist about what makes a viable book or a good book. And so that's, you know, so much of all of the things that I want to talk about today will circle disruption and sometimes go into disruption specifically. But I did want to just give some context about why I wrote that article in the first place, which was that it really was coming out of frustration that we're talking about things being disruptive that, in my opinion, didn't feel particularly disruptive at all. And I think the publishing industry can sometimes lack imagination. And it's probably one of the things that keeps us in a perpetual state of stagnation sometimes, and also with incremental movement forward. But of course, there's other places where there's been massive amounts of disruption, right? I mean, for those of you who have been in the industry a long time, I mean, even the advent of Amazon, or the fact that self-publishing is so much on the rise, or even the fact that myself and others of you out there who are hybrid publishers could even do hybrid publishing and have legitimacy in this space. All of that is disruption, you know, in a very big way. But of course, it's kind of hard to see if you're tracking it over years and years and years. And so it's good to encapsulate these things and take a look at them. So, you know, I think one of the things I wanted to say is that there's no one way to think about what is the right way to do publishing. There are standards, and I think that those are super important. But the reason that I also love this space, as I was saying, is that there's a thriving ecosystem here of people who are attempting new things, people who are doing things differently. We are not all the same. An ecosystem is, by definition, a complex or interconnected system. And I thought to myself, yeah, you know, publishing is complex and we are interconnected. And as such, you know, one of the things that is so important, as I was just saying, is around community, but instead, not in the IBPA space so much, but out in the world, there's a lot of infighting and sort of attempts to define, no, this is the real way that you do publishing, or legitimacy in publishing is this. And there's a constructed effort too to sort of maintain the top dogs as top dogs and to bar other entities from getting in, you know, and all these structures we have around who gets awards, right? And who can qualify for memberships and which books qualify to be reviewed. That's actually long been one of my pet peeves in the industry, and something that I spent a fair amount of time fighting for in the beginning. Of course, sometimes, as is the case with me, you win some of those battles and it feels really good, but then you stop that fight because you're on to the next fight, right? And I think because I have been a publisher who has fought so much for legitimacy, especially in the early years, those things, they still matter to me tremendously. And I think what's so important is to continue that fight, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons for the advocacy committee, and which is still ongoing, of course, but it's one of the reasons that I feel so strongly to continue to have these kinds of conversations and to publish the article in PW and to speak today, is because it's not enough to just say, okay, well, as myself, an individual publisher, I won the battle to be traditionally reviewed, or I won the battle to qualify for this award, or I won the battle to be in this organization. Largely across the industry, these kinds of barriers still exist. And I think one of the biggest disruptions that could and would happen would be the leveling of so many of those barriers. So that's one of the biggest things. I'm going to talk about disruptions big and small, but I do think independent publishers are where disruption is happening, right? Because we are here to change the game, and we actually have incentive and skin in the game to make that change, which is obviously something that people who are the old guard and kind of holding up the paradigm of what currently is, they have incentive for things to stay the same. And so there's an inherent tension. And I think that's why it's called disruption, is because there are people who don't want those changes to happen, and there are people with concerted efforts to make those changes happen. And that is, I think, where all of us would find ourselves. We're among the people who want to see change. Now, I do want to share a little bit about my history, which is I come out of traditional publishing, but even as a traditional publishing employee, I was always working for small presses, very small, in fact. Family owned was how I got my start, even though it was kind of a mid-sized publisher. And then I moved to Seal Press, and at Seal, even though we were acquired while we were there, it had this very strong indie sensibility. And I came up in book publishing always feeling like I was on the fringes. I was also a West Coast publisher, have always been a West Coast publisher. And for those of you who are outside of Manhattan, which is many of you, that there's this sort of automatic feeling that New York thinks it's best. And so you're sort of, you're on the fringes almost by default if you're a author publisher, a hybrid publisher, a small press, an indie press, anyone who is doing publishing outside of these big, massive systems of publishing. And it can bring out the fighter in you, I think, in a really good way. Of course, the truth is that those of us who are on the fringes are the majority. And that's the thing that I love to remind myself of as well, that we are in the majority and that all of us have this incentive to create change. And on some of the bigger pieces that I want to get to in this talk this morning, we do have agency and we do have power in numbers, but it just feels so hard to crack the code or to crack the nut, I guess, on some of these bigger issues because they're so deeply, deeply entrenched. But I think the way that we make these changes is by being part of an organization like this, by having an advocacy committee, by tackling big ideas that can get solved. And of course, some of the issues that I'm going to talk about today, I don't know if I feel that they're solvable, certainly not in the immediate, but I think in the long run, we may be forced to solve some of these problems due to extenuating circumstances, things like climate change or goods not being available. The current supply chain issues that we're seeing may force us into making some changes because of discomfort, because of cost, because of the planet that we live on. And so I'll get to those things in just a minute. Books have been really slow to change and compared to other industries. I mean, we're seeing this massive overhaul in recent years in the way that television is being done. I mean, I haven't had cable for the past 5 years, and growing up, I can't imagine not having cable, right? I mean, these are the kinds of huge disruptions that you see happening in industries like ours, or that are multimedia, or that are media kinds of companies or content companies. Books, because of the nature of our product, Streaming has not been something that we can do. You know, people have attempted all kinds of ways to make the book multimedia, but people still love print, even as we've seen an explosion in the digital market and an explosion in the audio market, you know, both of which I think have been really great disruptors, right? Because they've created new ways to get content out, and they've created new ways for us to make money. But at the end of the day, we still have this product that we have to ship, and we have to get into people's hands. And the other really cool thing about having a product, in my opinion, is that books are really cool, right? I mean, if you look at influencers, and we're talking about book talk, or on Instagram, Bookstagram, people want physical books to take pictures of, to line their bookshelves that look a lot better than my bookshelves, because I just throw everything back there and stack it in complete chaos. But, you know, if I were an influencer on Instagram, I would have very pretty bookshelves. But we love the tangible book, which makes things a little bit more difficult to disrupt. Also because books are truly the cultural barometer, you know, by which we measure our values. Books are so important to who we are as a people. Television and movies and music and art also, but books hold a really unique place in our culture, in our hearts, in our minds. And so we're up against some larger systems, I think some more pressured systems that are harder to change because of some of the actual tangibility of books and the difficulty to really disrupt from a technological standpoint, right? And then also, I was thinking about books, like why are books more difficult, you know, or why is disruption more difficult in the publishing industry than in other industries? And I think also it's because anyone can write a book. You know, the fact that we are such a literate culture and that so many people want to write books and do write books, I think that's a beautiful thing. It's something that I personally advocate for, and it's what I've staked my entire career on. But it also creates a tension because I think there's an immediate desire to create hierarchy, and for certain players in the industry to say, you know, we're better, and this is how we're going to measure our worth, you know, through advances, through barring you from being reviewed, from, you know, having this old guard and way of doing things seen as more legitimate, you know, simply because they've been around longer and they do things in a traditional manner. And many of us here don't believe that to be true. But as I said, there's a real incentive to keep that hierarchy in place. And so part of the disruption exists in breaking that down. And there is going to be a tension because nobody wants to lose status. You know, there's perhaps a parallel in what we're seeing play out in our own social environment today around, you know, who is best, right? And who gets, you know, who gets the accolades, who gets the status. And I see that in the publishing industry, and it's something that I've really worked hard to disrupt by being a hybrid publisher. So I do want to kind of go into some of the specifics of the known problems that we face and some of the solutions, and then go to the discussion, which Angela is going to come back on to help me curate. So I talked about infighting, you know, who matters and why. And so the solution there, I think, is inherently in inclusivity. Now, some people don't want that inclusivity, but I do think it's really important for us as a community to consider the ways in which we are inclusive of one another. I've been at other organizations and meetings where the desire to kind of say that traditional is the gold standard is so strong that there's no real seeing past that. Now, the gold standard is really just in the standards. It doesn't matter your publishing model. It doesn't matter if you're an author publisher, a hybrid publisher, or a traditional publisher, because if you adhere to the standards that IBPA has created and has, then we should all be on a level playing field. I really believe that to be true. And so in our community, what I love is that people do treat each other with that kind of respect, or perhaps people are ascending, you know, they're learning the trade. You're going to make some mistakes along the way, but you're educating yourself to make sure that these books that you're putting out into the world are the absolute best that they can be. But, we also have something to prove. And I think that that's true of indie publishers in general. You might be creating the most beautiful books. You might feel that you're at the top of your game and that your books rival any of the big 5 publishers, but maybe you haven't had a breakout bestseller yet. Maybe you haven't been able to qualify for certain awards. Maybe you feel like you're constantly being shut out of some of the channels that you want to be in. And I have to say, like, those battles are really worth fighting. We all need to be giving voice to the things that we're not comfortable with or that don't feel fair. I think we need to do that through writing. Obviously, we need to do it that the most obvious way to do it is by publishing the best books that we can publish. It is our product and the lists that we're creating and putting out into the world that prove our legitimacy, that show to the world, oh, okay, wow, that publisher is doing really incredible work. And we just keep showing up with excellence, every single list, season in, season out, excellence, until you start to get that momentum to say, you can't deny that we are as good as or better as anyone else. Even in the language that is used in the industry, or in the media, worse so, but also in the industry. I was reading something in the Washington Post recently, you might have seen it, about books as decor, which I thought was kind of interesting, backlist books being used as decorations in places like restoration hardware and restaurants. And it said, quote, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 to 700,000 books are printed each year, about 1 million if you count self-published books. And immediately I thought to myself, well, why would you not count self-published books? And why does that have to be a qualifier? So there's 600 to 700,000 books printed a year. Oh, but there's this other 1/3 of that amount, 300 more thousand books. So why not just say 1 million books are published a year? And so that kind of language too immediately serves to be divisive, immediately serves to say, oh, and this other group of people. And I think we also need to not stand for being othered, to call things out, to, again, speaking to the inclusivity. And I want to commend IBPA, of course, because I think we're one of the organizations that is absolutely leading the charge on inclusivity of language, of being very proud of our diverse membership, and also this idea that a thriving ecosystem has all sorts of publishing models, all sorts of people who are coming to the table and bringing really cool ideas and having the potential, of course, to be disruptive. And maybe just by its very existence of what you're doing, you are starting to be disruptive or are already being disruptive. So kudos to you if that's the case. All right, so a few more points that I want to bring up about some of this brought from my article and some new. In my article, I did talk about the fact that too many books are published each year. Well, I don't mean too many titles. When I say too many books are published each year, I'm not saying, oh, each of us should scale back our lists. No, not at all. I'm actually talking about the number of books that gets published each year, because largely the biggest publishers are publishing far more than they can sell. And sometimes I'm forced into that position as well. I think we all need to be thinking so much more smartly about how we do inventory. Some of you are print on demand, and honestly, I'm jealous. I would love to have a program in which we could be print on demand, but the economics don't make sense. And so we need to get to a place around money, right? Around the cost of print on demand for those publishers who want it, and the quality of print on demand to be good enough so that we can be proud to put those books out into the world, and also to be, I don't want to say cheap enough, because it's not really that the cost needs to go down, but where the cost is rising, we then need to have our books be priced in a way that we're not making pennies on sales. One of the reasons that we all overprint is because of economies of scale. And printers, of course, know this, and any veteran publisher knows this, that you get much better pricing the more books that you print. And so you're sort of incentivized, or perhaps seduced into printing more books than you need. And sometimes you don't know how many you need. And it's a unique and difficult problem in our industry, because of course the result is that those books eventually get pulped, or they go into landfills. And this is a unique problem around climate change and what Angela mentioned at the beginning around waste. It is such a wasteful industry, and it's one of the things that really keeps me up at night, that troubles me. And one of my friends, after I wrote the PW article, said, well, this doesn't make sense. What you're talking about, print on demand, doesn't make sense for children's books. It doesn't make sense for high design books, books that have foil stamps and all, pretty journals. I realize that 100%. So I do want to qualify that there are lots of different ways that each of you is publishing, and some of you are printing in China, and some of you have, gorgeous 4-color hardcover books that you could never do POD. And so I totally get that and want to say that out loud. But I do think we as an industry need to find ways to not be producing so much more than what we can sell. And this is about having smarter systems. It's about having a better handle on what we think we can sell, partnering with our distributors, those of us who have them, to do a better job with pre-sales. I did write that the system is broken because I think that there's not enough talking to one another. For those of us who have traditional distribution, it's like they're responsible to sell to the booksellers. The booksellers are not really talking to the publishers. And there's this really broken way that books go out into the market. And because we have to accept returns, there's not a whole lot of accountability on anyone's part to just say, we can only take this. There's all this sales potential that's sort of based on hope. And the result is tragically a lot of returns for some books, not all books, and then a lot of waste. And so one of the things that I see as a solution to too many books being published each year, I do think we need the destigmatization of POD. And I also think that we need to have more accountability on the part of retailers and booksellers. Now, there might be some booksellers in the market. I got some, in the room, I got some pretty terse emails from some booksellers after my article was published. And I do understand that, but I think we need to have better conversations between book publishers and booksellers, because we're so in a place to support one another. And I think it's one of the places where the communication breaks down the most, is that booksellers get resentful of publishers, and publishers are not supporting booksellers. And so it's this really problematic cycle that exists, and it just leads booksellers to say, well, we'll just carry the big books because everybody knows those books and we can return them en masse. And so I'd love to find a way for us to have better, more productive conversations between small publishers and booksellers. And there are ways that we can be showing up at conferences, right? Speaking to booksellers, calling on booksellers, I think is another huge way to be proactive and disruptive, right? And the best way is to cultivate relationships with booksellers and to let them know that you're on their side. It makes a huge, huge difference. All right, moving through my list. And then noting that I'll probably be speaking for another 7 to 10 minutes and then getting into conversation. Distribution, of course, is one of the biggest pain points of our industry. So I've been to tons of PubUs where people are just distraught over distribution, where either you don't understand it, you don't want it, it's a problem because of the percentages that they take, but you also feel shut out if you don't have it. You have lack of access without good distribution. And so it's a total cluster, and it's a frustrating one for most publishers. I have traditional distribution and it's a cluster. It's so frustrating because it's so inefficient. This is one of the ones that I do not have a solution to. I have sat on distribution think tanks before. I know that everyone in the industry wants this to be different, including distributors, because distributors are not making great profits and returns. It's not a very lucrative industry, aspect of the industry. The inefficiencies are enormous because of shipping, and storage, storing books, giant warehouses, shipping books out, taking books back. Again, speaking to climate concerns, this is just practically unsustainable. Amazon, obviously was a huge disruptor originally in this space of being a sort of distributor, although we can't really call it that. But of course, for author publishers, that is how you're getting your books out into the world. And that is how you're being distributed, right? Through extended distribution on Amazon. And so as frustrating as Amazon can be, they're actually a very positive disrupting force for any author publisher, because how else would you get your books out into the world? And how else would any of us be selling books at this time in the quantities that we're selling books, if not for Amazon? They're 50+% of our sales. And for some of you, I know they're much, much, much more than that. So I would love for all of us to be thinking more proactively about what are the solutions here. I think it's important to note the case of Brandon Sanderson recently. I am sure many of you have been following his Kickstarter campaign, which raised $41.7 million from 181,000 backers, the most funded Kickstarter in crowdfunding history, my notes say. Pretty amazing, right? And he is disruptive. On his own, he is disrupting something. It remains to be seen, but he's going to do his own distribution. He's going to fulfill all of those promises that he made to his readers. They're going to get digital ebooks, audiobooks, or physical books, and he's figuring out how to do that. He can figure that out, and he's one author. And so some of us might be needing to disrupt by saying, okay, well, what's our warehousing solution going to be? How are we going to approach this differently? How are we going to scale? Maybe we're going to partner with other publishers to get our own warehouse, or to fulfill differently, or to sidestep distribution in a way to have more co-ops. I think there are a lot of innovative solutions here. They're just hard, when we all have a lot going on. And so I want to just encourage people to be thinking outside of the box on distribution, especially for those of you who do not want traditional distribution because of the cut that it eats into your profits, which is really high for a lot of us. I wanted to speak to supply chain issues. Again, another immediate known problem. I think the only solution for this one is to stay flexible and to be okay with uncertainty. But the question is it going to get better? I don't imagine it will. We have paper shortages. We have even glue shortages, by the way. Our printer was telling us shortages on glue, shortages on paper. We have more and more books being published every year. Paper is expensive. It's only going to get more expensive. How many trees do we have to supply our ongoing demand for books? Cost of goods, right? Lack of access to that, and more competition. So this is a lot, right? So herein lies the issue that I put in my article, which was really focusing on more campaigns and sales around audiobooks and digital books. I think it's critical to our survival, both as an industry and humanity, to prioritize those forms, those mediums. The physical book is so important, but as an industry, we also can be celebrating those other forms of product that we have, right? And digital, for instance, could be something that is reviewable. Right now, you basically have to have a print book to get any kind of meaningful review. So a lot of this is just changing the way that we think about things and being more nimble. I'm certainly not advocating for getting rid of print books, and never, ever, ever would. And I think there are interesting ways to disrupt the industry moving forward in ways that are positive for all of us. So that's a big one. Now, a lot of this, I know Angela, I had to text Angela ahead of time and say, what am I allowed to say about pricing? Advocating for price points? No, we can't do that. But the book really is valued too low in general. Books are cheap. I think that Amazon has created a culture by which people expect cheap things. Even if we're putting our books out for sale between $16 and $20, Amazon is discounting those 30%, and people have this expectation that books should be inexpensive. And I also think we have a larger cultural phenomenon happening that content is free. Many of us write for free. Many of us are putting our books on sale for 0 to 99 cents in order to get people to do tons of downloads. We do have a bit of a cultural problem right now of discounting, and I don't just mean discounting in price, but discounting actually in a soul way, the value of words and content. Now, I think that's a modern phenomenon. I don't think it's necessarily going away. But I think what we need to do, of course, is say, okay, those print books that we're putting out in the world, even more so, need to be works of art, need to have beautiful design, right? Beautiful covers and interiors, and that the reading experience itself is something that you buy paper for, or you just love this book and you want it on your shelf, or you want it for your book talk or your bookstagram. And if we thought about it in that way, perhaps then paperback books would be more expensive and other forms of books would be less expensive, and we would pick and choose around the forms and mediums that we want to buy around different price points, and publishers wouldn't be suffering in the way that we are because it is such little return. And I think this is one of the biggest places that we're going to need to see disruption for those of us who want to continue to make it in this industry, right? I mean, I know almost every publisher I talk to is like barely turning a profit. Sometimes there are people at IBPA, because you're author publishers especially, but certainly other publishers as well, who are operating at a loss. That's not sustainable. You can't continue to have passion for what you're doing and put in the kind of hours that you're putting in when you're not making a profit in your business. So there is so much ahead of us. I'd love to hear what some of you think about ways to disrupt. We can have a conversation about that. I want to certainly remind all of us that we are perhaps on the fringes and we're the majority. And I love being part of this community where we can have hard conversations, where we can look at what's happening and sort of see the known problems, perhaps think about solutions, ideally capitalize on ways to make those solutions reality. I think that's really important, and actually a charge that each of us can carry moving forward. And there's strength in numbers, and we have the numbers here. We have the power to make change. We are actually louder voices in the room. One of the things about being the old guard and the traditional space, and especially the big five space, is that they're doing what they're doing. They're not incentivized to change. They don't join into these community conversations very often. Instead, you'll sort of hear the talking heads, talking about the future of publishing. Everything is great. We're on track to have profits, or, there's just not a whole lot of energy for engaging in the conversation about how can we make our entire ecosystem thrive. We, on the other hand, have energy for that conversation. I have energy for that conversation. And I hope all of you this week and next week, if you're going to Florida, will engage in those conversations and say, here's what I'm thinking about. Here's the challenges I have. I want to solve these things, because you can. I'd like to end by saying disruption is change. You can all be change makers, and many of you already are. Thank you. And I invite all of you to be the change makers that this industry needs. So thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. We're back. That was great. We're back.
Good to see you.
Well, I'm back. You've been here this whole time with your audience who's been chatting away. I like to see the hand claps and chat. Thank you so much for that. This is one of the best keynotes ever, as somebody said in the chat. That was really, really interesting. I want to respect the fact that we have all of these members here who have a lot of questions for you, and we have put their questions in the Q&A and have been upvoting. But I still want to ask you one cheeky question at the top of my own that I was thinking about when you started, and then
I love cheeky questions.
And then I'm just going to run through the audience questions. So do upvote the questions so that I know which ones you guys really want to tackle with Brooke. My cheeky question is just, you talk about, and you do it so well, you talk about how there's no right way to publish. And I get what you mean. The business model is irrelevant. Right. The standard is what matters. But if you were forced to suggest a wrong way to publish, how would you approach that,
Right, absolutely. Well, I talk a lot about the difference between being a visionary and a renegade. That being a visionary is a great thing, and being a renegade, not so much. And so I think when I look at that is that there are lots of people in this room who are visionaries, who are starting their own business, who have a lot of momentum and excitement. But the minute that you start to say, oh, that standard doesn't matter, or I don't need a mentor, or I'm just going to do this because I think it looks good, or not get any opinions on the matter. It's just, there are so many mistakes that publishers, especially newer publishers, make because they don't seek out support and help. And so absolutely, I have very strong feelings about that. So I thank you for qualifying. I absolutely mean that there's no wrong way to publish in terms of business model. So you're an author publisher, you're a hybrid publisher, you're a small publisher, you're a university press, whatever you might be. But yeah, there's a wrong way to publish for sure. And it's publishing in a way that doesn't adhere to the standards, and that makes mistakes because you don't see what you don't see. And then an industry professional looks at the book and is like, well, it doesn't hit the measures or the standards, and that is what promotes the stigma. And in my desire to, of course, remove that stigma, we need everybody to be adhering to those standards, or we're kind of crawling out of a hole here.
Like one bad apple.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, a little cheeky, but that's where I
totally always good. Bring it on. I bring the hard questions.
You mentioned in your talk, there were a lot of little like things we could tweet out that were pretty snappy, that sales potential is based on hope. And that's why we overprint and we ship out tons. And that's, you really did address returns pretty extensively in there, but it's also the most upvoted question here in the Q&A. So if we could just see if there's anything else that might be there to tease out your thoughts on this black hole of returns. You did discuss destigmatizing POD, which is, of course, something across the industry I think we can do. Conversations with booksellers. We're on your side conversations with booksellers, not finger wagging conversations with booksellers. Yeah. What else? Because we have a lot of frustrated people that are getting these chargebacks, and everybody does. I mean, I think one thing is you build it into your P&L if you can possibly do that, but any other things to tease out here?
I mean, this is really a hard one. Yes, returns are infuriating for publishers, and there's a lot that you said in there. I mean, I think I hear from authors and publishers sometimes like sort of an attitude of like, well, what's the bookstore going to do for me? And I always push back on that and say that is the exact opposite way you should be looking at this. What are you doing for the bookstore? And increasingly, bookstores are charging more and more co-op to even have events because they're irritated. And I think there's a bit of an animosity happening, and it creates a sort of a line in the sand with some bookstores of being like, well, we're just not going to do any events by anyone who is not traditionally published. And that is tragic. I mean, that's the thing that we want to avoid at all costs. And so, yeah, I think this reaching out to bookstores and having conversations, willingness to do consignment. We used to say never, ever, ever consignment. I mean, in fact, it's sort of a light breach of our contract with IPS to even do so. But some bookstores are so frustrated themselves that I've had to go to IPS and say, I'm actually going to do consignment with certain bookstores so that I'm providing that inventory and the author is the one who's taking it back into their own stock rather than returning it to Ingram. So that's a hard thing to sustain across 100 authors a year, which is what we have. But I think if you're small, that's certainly a way to sidestep it. Just being more nimble, having conversations and asking the booksellers as well, what are your pain points? What are your frustrations? So that you're not making assumptions about what you know about what they're going through. On returns, it's something I would love to see abolished. I think every publisher would, but the whole system would have to basically change and be broken in order for that to happen. And as I said, the terse emails that I got from booksellers was a bit of that's ridiculous. That could never happen. We would go out of business. And so I think there need to be better conversations between publishers and booksellers around how to support one another.
I'll acknowledge these terse conversations are longstanding. The chair before you was Peter Goodman of Stonebridge, and he said something
Right.
about our publishing universities about returns, and it was a very controversial statement that we had walked through the entire conference, and that was many, many, many years ago. It sticks with us.
Yeah.
You just kind of spoke a bit about, so for the crowd, I think you probably picked up on it. Brooke has traditional distribution through Ingram. She said the acronym IPS a couple times. That's Ingram Publisher Services. Traditionally, those deals can be, you have to work through your distributor to make sales. You can't make outside deals. But you did talk a bit about how you are thinking about consignment and trying to make relationships with individual bookstores so that you can sell. And what does your distributor say about that?
Well, as I said, it's kind of a light breach of contract that as long as they know it's happening, it just is sort of having to happen. I think there's a lot of frustration within IPS as well. That's the thing is, I think that there's tension between the booksellers and the distributors, right? I mean, there's tension points at every piece. Each relationship has its own tensions. And I think this is really coming to a head right now because of supply chain issues, because of charges, because of delays, and also depending on who your distributor is. I mean, some people don't have one, some people have IPS, some people have IPG, but there's been a real concerted effort on IPS's part to try to get the bookstores to order out of a single warehouse. And many people do not want to order out of a single warehouse. So this is where, some of the systems that are in place, attempts to streamline, create animosity, and so I don't have the solutions to those problems either, but I do listen to the complaints and therefore try to say, okay, well, how can we do this differently and better? And having those relationships with the bookseller certainly creates a situation for us where not perfect, but we're at least having events. And that is something that matters to our authors.
It is a tension point. We hear from a lot of our members who do have distribution, but they feel hamstrung a bit. They can't reach out to booksellers directly and sell directly. Their distributor has to do that all. And when the distributor can't do it, it's a very frustrating experience all around.
And we want that, by the way. I just want to say our preference is for the bookstore to order from IPS. But I find that if you listen and say, what are the issues, that helps them to see that you're not just with this attitude, right? The attitude of like, oh, well, you're a bookstore, so you're supposed to sell my books. That's a kind of common and very problematic mindset that publishers have, like the bookstore exists to serve you just because you publish books and they sell books. And that is, I would say maybe one of the things that I hear the most from booksellers, just sort of this entitlement on behalf of publishers, when in fact you should be asking, you probably have to expect to pay something to have an event, or to really support them to better understand, the ordering mechanisms. Or we have done a thing of saying, okay, well, we're going to ship books to the Oregon warehouse so that the West Coast publishers can order those books, even if Ingram is saying we prefer they order out of a different warehouse, right? So being more proactive in your approach on all fronts, which requires understanding what's going on.
Great. I'm going to call that an answer to James's question about how do you work with bookstores directly without attitude and with an open mind, an open heart to understand what they really need is great advice there.
Yeah.
If there's more, and please share in the chat too, if you guys have had successful relationships. We actually this year came into our advocacy committee, discussed event fees and what does that mean? Is there something to do about it? And came to the conclusion it just feels like a thing that is happening now.
Yeah.
And to pay or not pay based on what you're able to do. So this is a high level question from Joe. What's the one distribution you wished you had done, but you let it pass? And is there a distribution you've pushed, but in hindsight, think it wasn't quite right? That's like a closer. That's like a strong close question. So some sort of a distribution, you can help me because we just talked about
Disruption.
Disruption.
Is that the question? I was like, distribution. Wait, say the question again with disruption.
Brain can knock it off the distribution. What's the one disruption you wished you had done and let pass? We'll start there.
Oh my gosh, that is a really hard question. One disruption I wish, some of these things are disruptions that I would like to do that me alone, Brooke at She Writes, can't do by myself, and so I think one of the disruptions, I haven't let this go, I'm still thinking about it, but the idea that I posed there at the end around some sort of collective, right, that there would be a group of publishers who maybe have more muscle collectively to affect some of these changes or to make some headway on some of our known pain points. I have had success, even and notably with IBPA, right? Being on a committee and having the backing of IBPA to actually create some things that are meaningful. So that's to say, I think there's still a lot more to be done. So maybe I've sort of passed it by, but still want to. But some of these things, changing policies, getting bookstores to, say that they don't want returns, which will never happen. I don't know how, there at some point, I do believe in my lifetime, there will be some sort of collapse that happens that needs to be rebuilt just simply because of these pressures around prices, supply chain, shipping, just the inefficiencies that I mentioned that create a breaking point at some point.
Right. Yeah. And we talked about coming into this year, it being this kind of strange transition year too, for a lot of things, our whole culture coming through COVID and, the tendrils of that and how that's going to affect us as we move forward. And I think there will be some interesting disruptions. And any disruption that you pushed and you wished you hadn't?
No, nothing I wish I hadn't. A lot of the disruption in my early days were around just simply being proud of my model. Many people know hybrid has been around for a long time, but no one talked about it. It was like the elephant in the room, hush, don't you dare say out loud that you have a subsidized author model. And I got that over and over and over again. Why didn't you just do this without saying anything about the fact that the author subsidizes? And I didn't want that. I always wanted it to be out in the open and to say, if the author is contributing, that is not a reason to discount how amazing this book is. So I think that's probably the biggest disruption that I myself have offered, is just opening up this conversation and creating more space for more models, certainly in this space, the hybrid and the author publisher model, to just be indie and proud and to say, yeah, we're subsidizing our own books. Our books are awesome. We're entrepreneurs, we're partners in this process. So that's the one I answered a different question, which is the one I'm most proud of. But there's nothing that that I can look at and say, I wish I hadn't.
Across the board disruption. That's where we're at. If it can be disrupted, let us disrupt it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a lot of interest in returns and disrupting that space. So I want to, and you kind of you leaned into this a little bit too in your talk, where I love the conversation about the book being a status, and we line our shelves with books so people know how smart we are. I don't think I've read 40% of them, just FYI, but they're there, and I'm very smart because I have them. And then how we should maybe focus on the sale of audiobooks and ebooks as things too, that could be someplace that we could look that could be disruptive. But Amazon has started to take returns on audiobooks. There was a whole audiobook return situation that was a big deal in the industry last year, and ebooks as well, or the ebooks was the big
right
kerfuffle from last year.
but
So-
not very many. I mean, comparatively, the quantity is so low, and of course, you're not paying shipping. But yes, I mean, my authors ask me all the time, how can you return an ebook? But we're usually seeing 1s and 2s, whereas the returns on print can be quite big, and some accounts more egregious than others, of course, to the extent that we're mindful of how many books we might send to a certain account who is known to send us a lot of returns. So I think that's something to keep in mind, just being very smart as publishers and saying, yeah, if this particular outlet keeps sending you returns, maybe you need to be not sending them as many books, or you're in charge of how many books you send. That's an important thing to remember, that you're in the driver's seat, and we are mindful of that. We don't always, sometimes I will change the projection and say, I realize that this account said it wants 400, but we're going to send 100, which is sort of the opposite of what a traditional publisher would do. They'd say, you said you want 400, we'll send you 2,000. So
Godspeed. So well. So for your company, then, at least you wouldn't raise the red flag on returns related to audiobooks and ebooks. It's not something that's
it's not something that we've seen in big enough numbers for me to be super concerned at this point. It is a thing, it exists, but so far it's been in very small numbers. I think if it got to be very big, perhaps I would raise a red flag. I would be curious to know if people are experiencing those in the tens and hundreds.
Yeah. Chat away, folks, if you've seen a lot of that in your company. I know there were a number of things that were fixed about the ebook returns on Amazon last year. The AAP did a bunch of advocacy around that, and we joined into that advocacy as well. But yeah, it's still something that can happen. You can return an ebook. Can you talk about PR? It's another thing you leaned into a little bit in your talk too, about how there can be some stigma against just your business model, and that can keep you out of awards and contests and associations and things. So can you talk about getting PR coverage for your titles coming from a non-traditional publisher? Karen finds traditional media being very closed off to non-traditional and to indie publishers.
Yeah, I think that is about just having an endless capacity, I guess, for conversation on these topics. I really make sure that my publicists send me any pushback. And I'm not that I've spoken to every media person on the planet, but I'm sure like many of them know my stance. And some people will change their minds. I mean, I've had that happen before. I'll offer to send books. You have to have the quality to back your claim, right? I know that when I am coming into that conversation, that I can actually say our books are as good as traditionally published books. So you better be sure they are. And if they are, that has been the best solution for me, is to say, look, we have the track record. We have the books. I would love to send you a box of books. I would like to tell you more about our program. So there's a bit of building toward that, and so obviously we're far along now, we're at 10 years down, but in year 1 and 2, I was really proud of our books. And then over time, they started to win awards, and the authors themselves incredibly proactive. So those authors then act as ambassadors for your program. So I think there's ways that you need to focus on getting some awards, the ones you can win for your books, to be able to call yourself an award-winning publisher. And then when media pushes back, to say, actually, here's what you might not know. I mean, I will go into those conversations just with a ridiculous amount of confidence. And sometimes they say no. We still have a hard line in the sand, but many of them are like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. And now, I don't know when you say non-traditional what you mean, but if you're a hybrid publisher or an author publisher, you just want to hitch yourself to someone who's doing it really well and say, well, would you review this publisher, or this author, because I'm doing the same thing as them.
Right. I really like that. At the top, though, I mean, if you're going to create, first of all, you're going to create a book that is going to sit on the shelf with any of the other books that could possibly
Absolutely
the highest caliber possible. And you're going to know that, and you're going to have the confidence in those conversations to be able to speak to that. And then you're just going to be banging on that wall in your case for the last 10 years. But I think you've had some, I don't know if you can talk about it, maybe not, but there was something I'm remembering about an organization that didn't want to have hybrid publishers, and you banged on that door for years and years, and then they said, okay. Is that something that I'm remembering? Or that
yeah, that was Kirkus. And it was a huge win for me when it finally happened. They were saying no hybrid, no hybrid, no hybrid. And then when I talked to them about why, I said, oh, well, it's about distribution. And so I said, well, then your measure should be distribution and not author subsidization. So sometimes if you get to the heart of what they think the problem is, and you're like, well, I have that thing. Mm-hmm. So in our case, we do have traditional distribution. In other publishers' case, you might not. But that's why I think it's really important to have these conversations. It's just the same as the bookseller to say, well, what are you objecting to? What is the problem? And really important to educate yourself. I mean, you have to know the ins and outs of the industry, right? You have to be able to counter whatever their objection is with the language that makes sense to them. So keep talking, right? I can't say enough for those of you who are maybe newer to the space, and some of you have been around for forever, but to, either get a mentor or to be in a mastermind group with other publishers, to capitalize on the resources that IBPA offers you, because this is a very complex industry. As many of you know, and the deeper in you get, the more you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much I don't know. I had that for years. I had 13 years of book publishing experience, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a publisher, I know nothing. And so keep at that, because you're not going to be able to have these conversations and sort of win the intellectual battle if you don't know exactly how to respond to their objections.
Right, speaking the language in which they're used to speaking. We like it complicated. It just makes us feel smarter as we're working through our various careers. So can you address the disruption as a vehicle for diversifying the voices that are published? How has that worked in your company, or how do you see that disruption working in that space?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about disruption in the most broad terms, anyone with a non-traditional publishing model is disrupting the industry, right? And I think what's happening out of 2020 and all of the social justice stuff, for instance, that's the culture forcing the traditional folks to disrupt themselves by saying, hey, guess what? You need to value diverse voices, writers of color, whatever it is. And that has happened, but that was an outside force saying, this is not okay. You need to change. And the big publishers did change. And if you look at the lists right now and the diversification across even who they've hired and the emphasis on DEI, that is kind of incredible, right? Because that was a cultural force insisting upon disruption that those people might not have otherwise taken. We're sort of automatically, as indie publishers, I think, always interested in diversification, and because we're more nimble and we don't have the same P&Ls. So I think there's an interesting question of sort of how the culture impacts book publishing and how book publishing impacts the culture and the reciprocity of that relationship. So absolutely, the world is sort of pushing us to value these things. And I think that's a hugely important moment for publishers and for writers.
Yeah, and we've seen, I'm going to close this out here because we're just a minute over. We've seen in the independent publishing space that you guys have been bringing some of the most diverse voices into the culture that we need to see. We have been seeing it. It's been there for a very long time. And I'm glad that the big 4 or 5 or 4 are catching up. But I want to applaud independent publishing for always kind of being at the forefront of that. We've run out of time. We're at overtime. I want to suggest, Brooke, how can people chat more with you? There were more questions we couldn't get to. Can they find you in the platform if they want to ask other questions?
Absolutely. I will hang out over there on the platform today. I'll log in right after we get out, and also on social media. I'm very active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, welcome you finding me there at either my name or my name with underscore between Brooke and Warner, and would love that. Yeah, and also just Brooke at shewritespress.com for people who have something really pressing. I'll do my best to respond to everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, you can send a chat to her in the platform if that's the easiest way for you to find her. But I want to thank you again for agreeing to do the opening keynote. Such a wonderful way for us to get
Thank you for
started.
inviting me.
Yeah, it was wonderful to talk to you, and I'm glad we had a little space for questions as well. Thank you guys for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of conference. You can head over to the help desk if you want to chat with an IBPA staff member on a video one-on-one to maybe just say hi and say thank you.
Fabulous.
Fabulous work.
Enjoy, everyone.
Absolutely. Have a great day, guys. See you later.
Bye. See you out there.